and for joining us for our special WSJ Plus In Their Words event. I want to say a big thank you to our event partner, Barnes & Noble, for hosting us this evening. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage tonight's special guests for an in-depth discussion of bad blood, secrets and lies in a Silicon Valley startup. Please welcome the Wall Street Journal's award-winning investigations editor, Michael Sicanolfi, and the Wall Street Journal's Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter and the author of Bad Blood, John Carreyrou.
Thank you, everybody. We appreciate you coming and also all the support on behalf of the Wall Street Journal. We very much appreciate it. Tonight we're going to talk about Theranos and John's reporting on this, but I think it's going to be a real treat. Hopefully we're going to give you a front row seat into what has really been one of the most remarkable journalistic journeys of recent years. And so let me just formally introduce John, who has been one of the most accomplished investigative reporters on the planet for a long time now. I've had the pleasure of working with him for many years. But I think it's fair to say that with all the challenges that John has faced, this is probably the most challenging assignment for a number of different reasons. So we'd like to just make this interactive to the extent we can. So if any of you feel like you need to ask questions or butt in at any point, if you ever came to the Journal newsroom, you know that would be perfectly usual event. I just wanted to start just asking a few questions of John, and I guess the first let me just as a backdrop, Theranos, just for those of you who aren't completely aware, is a Silicon Valley company, a startup that sought to revolutionize the blood testing business. And so what they did is, instead of venous draws, drawing blood from your arm, which some people felt was uncomfortable, and particularly Elizabeth Holmes, the founder of Theranos, who used to sing that song a lot. They said that they had revolutionary technology that allowed them to take just a drop or two of blood from your finger, a finger prick, and be able to determine a wide range of diseases and other issues. So John, let's just go back real quickly to 2015. Theranos is a wildly successful Silicon Valley startup. They've drawn in hundreds of millions of dollars from big-name investors, either valued at probably more than $9 billion. What was it that tipped you off that something might be amiss here? How did it all start for you?
Well, Elizabeth Holmes had rocketed to fame about a year earlier. She had graced the cover of Fortune magazine in, I think, June of 2014, and had attracted a ton of media coverage, but I actually had not noticed her, and I wasn't aware of Theranos until I read a profile of her in the New Yorker magazine. I'm a longtime subscriber of the New Yorker, and I often read it on my way to and back from work. I live in Brooklyn, and the Journal newsroom's in Manhattan, and during a commute back on the F train one evening in December of 2014, I read this long profile of Elizabeth Holmes. And there were a couple things that struck me as odd in that story. The main one was the notion that this college dropout, she had dropped out at 19 years old as a sophomore at Stanford, and had done like two semesters of chemical engineering classes, and she had supposedly dropped out and gone on to pioneer groundbreaking medical science. I had covered healthcare and medicine for most of the previous 10 years, and I couldn't remember of anything like that. Usually in medicine, you need formal training, you need to go to medical school, you need to get sometimes a PhD, do postdoctorate studies, and then do years and decades of research to add value. I know that the dropout thing has happened in the realm of the computer industry with people like Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, who were essentially self-taught programmers.
But it's one thing to be skeptical and to see all that.
Right.
So how then do you take that, and how did you go into it?
Yeah, no, and I probably would not have done anything with that intuition if I hadn't then gotten a tip a few weeks later. And the tip came from a guy who had been a source the previous year. He was a practicing pathologist in the Midwest, and he moonlighted as the writer of this obscure blog called Pathology Blog, and it's spelled BLAWG, which I'm pretty confident in saying didn't have many readers. He had read the New Yorker story too, and he knew more than I did about blood testing and had been immediately dubious of the claims that, that they had invented a way to do the full range of lab tests, hundreds of lab tests off a drop of blood pricked from the finger. So he had written up a short skeptical post on his blog declaring himself a skeptic, and then been quickly contacted by a guy, a colorful character by the name of Richard Fuse, who had been Elizabeth Holmes's childhood neighbor in Washington, D.C., and later become an opponent in patent litigation, and had essentially been steamrolled by Holmes and Theranos in this patent litigation and lost it, but during the litigation had become convinced that Theranos was a scam. Fuse was a medical inventor and a trained doctor, and he smelled a rat. And it so happened that he had just made contact with an employee of Theranos who had just left the company and who had been the laboratory director at Theranos. So when I heard first from the pathology blogger that there was a guy named Fuse who had talked to an employee, I thought, well, okay, there's several layers of secondary and tertiary sources, but maybe if I can pull on this string and speak to the employee who has primary information, then this might be a story. And so I eventually made contact with this laboratory director who just left the company, and he was terrified when I first spoke to him because he'd been harassed for weeks by Theranos lawyers, and he would only speak to me if I protected his identity, so I agreed to grant him confidentiality. I figured, it was just rumors and innuendo if I couldn't get someone like him who had real primary information to speak to me. And that was the beginning of a 9-month investigation.
So there you were, you had a great tip, you had somebody that wasn't on the record, so we're a long way from doing anything. So you start making calls over a period of weeks, start gathering a little string, and then, there was an interesting point early on where Theranos started putting pressure on. I mean, I know you were used to getting a lot of pressure and pushback. I think there was an extraordinary amount. Can you talk a little bit about the pressure that Theranos put on you and on the journal, and then there was actually a big meeting that was pretty dramatic in which all this came to a head even before you wrote a word.
Right. So I'd say I spent 2 months gathering more information, trying to corroborate what this lab director had told me, and making some progress in doing so, and even going to Phoenix where Theranos was offering its fingerstick tests in Walgreens stores, and getting doctors and patients to speak to me about these questionable test results they'd received.
You got one of the tests yourself, right?
Right, and at that point I felt like I was beginning to reach a critical mass of reporting, and I started approaching Theranos, or rather they had hired an external PR guy and had heard that I was poking around, and so they reached out to me first, but I was on the verge of reaching out to them. And I'd say after that first contact, the month and a half that followed, they sort of gave me the runaround, and I think hoped that I would just go away. And I didn't. And it was also a surreal period because as they gave me the runaround, she kept on doing interviews and media appearances, to the point where one night I lift my head up in the newsroom and I look at the TV screen and she's on Charlie Rose. So I then, the next morning, in fact, I got into a yelling match with the outside PR guy, and I said, you guys have to engage with me, I'm not going to go away if you think that's what I'm doing. And that's when they went from putting me off to beginning a very fierce counterattack. And the first salvo was a meeting we had at the Wall Street Journal newsroom. David Boies came. So I had been asking for an interview with either Elizabeth Holmes or Sunny Balwani, the #2 executive, or both. And they agreed to a meeting, but I sensed that it wasn't going to be with either of those people, and that it was going to be mostly lawyers. And sure enough... Let
me just interject for a second, and we'll get to it. David Boies is one of the most powerful lawyers in the nation. He was involved as a director at one point too at Theranos, so he was somebody who, had a great reputation, and he was very strongly supporting Theranos and everything they're doing and coming at us really strong. So what do you do in this meeting, John?
So they showed up with 7 people, 4 of whom were lawyers. One of the lawyers was David Boyes, and there were 2 basically PR people, and then 1 Theranos executive out of 7 people. And so we sat down, and 2 of the lawyers put little tape recorders at each end of the conference table. And it became very clear that they were approaching this as a deposition in a future legal proceeding. By putting those little tape recorders on each side of the conference table, they were signaling to us that, litigation threats were already in the air. And then the meeting started. Mike was there. I brought Mike along, and Jason Conti, who's now the general counsel of Dow Jones, the journal's parent company. And, the fireworks went off pretty much immediately. Do you want to?
Well, I mean, to say it was tense is an understatement. It was a 5-hour meeting. People didn't want to go to the restroom at any point to break it off. John had about 80 questions or so for them. And rather than answering any of them, they just constantly were threatening us, saying that we were going to be disclosing trade secrets, and things got pretty heated.
Right, and that we needed to either destroy them or return them immediately. The main question I kept trying to get answered was how many blood tests of they had 250 tests roughly on their menu. How many of them are done on your proprietary technology, and how many are done on third-party machines bought off the shelf from diagnostic equipment companies? And obviously it was a leading question because I knew from my sources that a small fraction of the tests were done on the Theranos technology and that it wasn't reliable, but they just would not answer the question. They kept on invoking trade secrets. And so we went around in circles, and it became almost absurd because, I think I said at one point, how can anything involving a third party's machine be a Theranos trade secret? And so, the answer we were given is it was much more complicated and nuanced than the way I was framing it. Anyways, we went around in circles. It got heated at various moments. David Boyes let us know that he was going to write us a letter soon after this meeting, which disbanded at about 6 in the evening. And one of the lawyers, Heather King, former Hillary Clinton aide and former Boyce Schiller partner, had recently become the general counsel of Theranos, and I swear she looked like she wanted to put a knife in my heart. And from there,
Sure enough, a few days later, we got the first of many letters basically threatening to sue us, telling us to retain all our records. I know there are a couple of questions. We can just interject quickly, and then we'll keep on. I know the gentleman out here would ask.
Right at the beginning, before all you were going was listening to this one director. How did they find? Is that unusual? They would find out and start even asking questions.
Well, it wasn't just one source. It started with one source, but then John over the few.
No, so are you saying how did they? So they did eventually figure out who some of my confidential sources were.
No,
that's not your question.
How they even heard it? If you really hadn't started anything yet, you hadn't written anything. You were just.
No. I had been reporting the story for months at that point. I had started in early February of 2015, and this meeting was in June, late June.
Right. And what happened after that first that key call, was John then started just expanding the horizon of people he was speaking about who either worked at the company currently or formerly, and so then and some of them probably were scared or maybe they reported back to the company. So there were many ways in which they were sort of pretty plugged into.
Right. Yeah. No, but by the time of that meeting, which was months after I had started, I had really amassed a critical mass of information. And anyways, this sort of scorched earth campaign against us to try to either get us to abandon the story or be intimidated went into overdrive because several of my confidential sources were surveilled by private investigators. I don't know if they were hired by Boyce Schiller on behalf of Theranos or by Theranos itself. I came to learn later, one of my sources, a young man by the name of Tyler Schultz, who's the grandson of the former Secretary of State George Schultz, who was a board member. Tyler had been one of my corroborating sources, and he suddenly went dark. He had been in contact with me via burner phone and an email address with a pseudonym, and suddenly he wasn't responding to my calls or to my emails. And so I learned later that they put him through an intense ordeal where two of the Boyce Schiller attorneys even ambushed him at his grandfather's house, and the company threatened him with litigation and told him his career would be ruined if he essentially didn't recant what he had told me, and they also wanted him to name my other sources. And amazingly, Tyler never caved in to this pressure and never signed any of the documents that the company put to him. And in no small part, thanks to him, we were able to go to press finally with my first story in October of 2015.
Right. And Tyler, by the way, it was a pretty tragic family story because, again, as John mentions, his grandfather, George Shultz, has this legacy as Secretary of State. Obviously, he's a great U.S. statesman. And Tyler was concerned that his last act was going to be as a director of this fraudulent company. And so he appealed to his grandfather, to try to help. And instead, what he got was, a backlash from his grandfather. So it really ruined in some ways the relationship.
Yeah, they became estranged for a while. On his way out, Tyler had worked for 8 months at Theranos after graduating from Stanford and had become convinced during his 8 months there that the company was essentially a fraud. And on his way out had tried to get his grandfather, who was a board member, to see the light. And George Shultz had essentially sided with Elizabeth Holmes and told him that he was wrong. And so he had to keep that bottled in until I came along a year later and then confided in me and became one of my sources. And at that point, the company figured out that he was talking to me and put the screws to him. And again, George Shultz sided with the company and with Elizabeth Holmes, and they became estranged and didn't see each other for a year, could communicate only through lawyers. It was a messy situation.
He's since become obviously a heroic figure for really speaking. You had a great line about fraud is
not a trade
is not a trade secret, which I think has become iconic. Yes. That's a great question. For those who didn't hear, the question was about, when Elizabeth Holmes started this company, did she have malice or forethought? Did she go into it, attempting to fraud? By the way, just to start that off, we want to talk a little bit about Elizabeth, who's just a fascinating character who had a very interesting dad, a very interesting childhood. She, at a very young age, knew what she wanted to do. Talk a little bit about that as you lead into answering that.
Yeah. So the short answer is I don't think so. No, I don't think she went in with malice, and I'll expand on that. She was born in 1984. That makes her about 34 now. It made her 19 when she dropped out of Stanford in 2003. She had her father was had spent most of his career as a civil servant, and her mother had worked on Capitol Hill. The one sort of thing that I think weighed in the way she was raised was that she was descended through her father from the Fleischmann Yeast dynasty. And the Fleischmann Yeast Company was a company that was founded in the 1880s by two Hungarian immigrants, Charles and Max Fleischmann. And by the turn of the 20th century, the Fleischmanns were one of the richest families in America. And a Danish physician married into the family. He married Betty Fleischmann. His name was Christian Holmes. He married Betty Fleischmann, the daughter of Charles Fleischmann. And so the Holmes name sort of married into this billionaire. They were really the equivalent of today's billionaires. And unfortunately, the younger generations of the Holmes family had squandered the fortune. So Chris Holmes, Elizabeth's father, raised her with these tales of this terrific entrepreneurial dynasty that became fabulously wealthy at the turn of the 20th century, but he also made her well aware of the failings of the younger generations, namely his grandfather and father, who had squandered the family wealth. And so I think that played a role in her ambition.
Wasn't there a great, I'm sorry to interrupt, there's a great moment, she's about 9 years old, she's at a family gathering, and one of the relatives asks her what she wants to do when she grows up?
Right, and she says, I want to be a billionaire. And the relative says, don't you want to be president? And she says, no, because the president will marry me. I'll have $1 billion. And so she wanted to become fat. I think she wanted to restore that faded glory. And once again, be among the very wealthy families in America and have that status. But her father also raised her, with this notion that she should do good. He had worked at the State Department and at USAID, and there were photos of him offering disaster relief in war-torn countries. And he always told her that she should live a life of purpose. And so I think for her, those twin goals of becoming wealthy and also doing good, I think, the gateway to it was biotechnology, where you could build a startup that would become, a great company, but then also do good with a medical product. And to come back to your original question, I think she dropped out of Stanford at 19, wanting to become a successful entrepreneur. She idolized Steve Jobs. She wanted to walk into his footsteps. And she's someone who, over the course of the ensuing 12 years, encountered setbacks and sort of refused to draw the right lessons from those setbacks and papered them over and kept over-promising to investors and claiming that she had achieved things that she had not achieved, and eventually the gap between what she claimed she had achieved and what the reality of the product was so huge that it became what the SEC later called a massive fraud. The fraud became especially egregious when the company went live with its faulty fingerstick tests, because then it became not only about defrauding investors of hundreds of millions of dollars, but also she put patients in harm's way, and she did it knowingly.
Yeah, and on that latter point, I mean, she showed a real venal side inside Theranos. I mean, John, one of the great moments in the book, I think, is when there was somebody pretty early on in the life of the company who raised questions about the technology, and she got really upset and she fired this person. But then I think she created some bogus excuse,
right,
that was just outrageous.
So the prologue of the book, for those of you who have not read it, is basically this scene that takes place in late 2006, so not even 3 years into the life of the company. And the CFO, who's been on the job for 8 months, the chief financial officer, learns that these demos that they're staging for investors at the company's offices are bogus. That part of the demos, namely the part where you get the blood test result at the end, that's a fake. The blood test result is pre-recorded, and it's not. Doesn't reflect the actual experiment that went on live. And so he confronts her and he says to her, that's going too far, because you're getting very close to, if not crossing the line into fraud. And she turns ice cold and says to him, you're not a team player. I think you should leave right now. And she means not just her office, she means the company. And then a few days later, the head of IT at the company is loading the departing CFO's the contents of his laptop back onto the company's servers, and stumbles upon the fact that the CFO has browsed porn on his work laptop. So
which we're not advocating in any way.
He hesitates to tell Elizabeth about it, but he ends up doing so, and she seizes on that to not only deny the CFO his stock options, but also to tell the board that that's why he was fired, which was untrue. And certainly he shouldn't have browsed porn on his work laptop, but and we don't condone that. But that was not why he had been fired. He had been fired because he was calling her on the fake demos. And so this is a woman who at that point is 22 years old, I think it's even if it were a man, I find that it would be ruthless behavior even for a 22-year-old, young man to behave this way, and it sort of gives you an idea of her personality and how she functions.
So how is she able to?
Are you going to give the boyfriend any credit?
The boyfriend, Sunny Balwani, yeah. So at that point, yeah. No, for sure. He you know, he eventually joined the company, and he really was her partner in crime, and it was a fraud perpetrated by two people in a partnership, for sure.
I definitely like to delve more into Sonny because he's a fascinating character as well. But just what was it about Elizabeth that was so mesmerizing? How was she able to get a star-studded board, but B, as important for the company, just all these investors, these wealthy investors? You know, she had this. It seemed like she had an ability to never blink. This humongous blue eyes. She had this deep voice. You know, what was it?
Well, I mean, it's partly Steve Jobs' fault. Because, and I say that it's sort of half seriously, because Jobs has popularized this notion that, you know, if you're a founder in Silicon Valley with a cool vision, that, you know, you're infallible and you walk on water. And, you know, even to this day, there are examples of it, like Elon Musk. There are people who think that that guy's an absolute genius. And he has achieved a few things, but these people, after all, are just like we are, you know, and they have, they do some good things and they do some bad things, and they're certainly not infallible. But she capitalized on this cult of the personality that you know, goes back to Steve Jobs and even before Steve Jobs, and she portrayed herself as basically the second coming of Steve Jobs, and she, you know, over the years, started using a deeper voice. She really...
You started using?
What's that?
What do you mean started using? I mean, there's an anecdote...
No, yeah. No, I mean, I have multiple evidence to corroborate that anecdote, that she changed her voice. I mean, it's not that hard for both men and women to deepen their voices. And that was one of the things she did. She started wearing a black turtleneck. But mainly, she was super intelligent and really passionate about, you know, creating this device that would do good, and charismatic. And with all those traits, she was able to get, I mean, it's kind of controversial to say, but she was able to get one older man after another on board to support her. You look at the facts, it started with her Stanford Engineering School professor, Channing Robertson, and then Don Lucas, the aging venture capitalist who had groomed Larry Ellison, then George Shultz starting in 2011, and you know, Jim Mattis, Rupert Murdoch, you know, David Boies.
We'll get to him later too.
And so these, you know, these men became sort of bewitched by her, and I don't, you know, I'm not necessarily hinting at anything sexual, but I think they really were wowed by her, and she was able to, you know, wrap them around her finger, and before you knew it, she had this unbelievable board of larger than life, you know, people with fantastic resumes who had been ex-cabinet members and ex-military commanders. But one thing you'll notice is that not a single one of them was a woman.